Chapter 2. The Development of Indian Civilization from c. 1500 BC to 300 CE. The gradual decline of the Indus civilization marks the beginning of the transition, over the span of roughly 1,800 years, from prehistoric to historic times. Among many remarkable developments, the period is notable for the rise and fall of vast and small states, notably the Mauryan Empire, the further spread of Indo-Aryan speakers and, later, the invasion of Alexander the Great, the emergence of great religions, and remarkable achievements in literature and the arts. Traditional approaches to Indian historiography. The European scholars who reconstructed early Indian history in the 19th century regarded it as essentially static, and Indian society as concerned only with things spiritual. Indologists, such as the German Max Müller, relied heavily on the Sanskritic tradition and saw Indian society as an idyllic village culture emphasizing qualities of passivity, meditation, and otherworldliness. In sharp contrast was the approach of the Scottish historian James Mill and the utilitarians, who condemned Indian culture as irrational and inimical to human progress. Mill first formulated a periodization of Indian history into Hindu, Muslim, and British periods, a scheme that, while still commonly used, is now controversial. During the 19th century, direct contact with Indian institutions through administration, together with the utilization of new evidence from recently deciphered inscriptions, numismatics, and local archives, provided fresh insights. Nationalist Indian historians of the early 20th century tended to exaggerate the glory of the past, but nevertheless introduced controversy into historical interpretation, which in turn resulted in more precise studies of Indian institutions. In more recent times, historians have reconstructed in greater detail the social, economic, and cultural history of the subcontinent. The politics has continued to influence the study of Indian history. A major change in the interpretation of Indian history has been a questioning of an older notion of Oriental despotism as the determining force. Arising out of a traditional European perspective on Asia, this image of despotism grew to vast proportions in the 19th century and provided an intellectual justification for colonialism and imperialism. Its deterministic assumptions clouded the understanding of early interrelationships among Indian political forms, economic patterns, and social structures. Trends in early Indian society. A considerable change is noticeable during this period in the role of institutions. Clan-based societies had assemblies, whose political role changed with the transformation of tribe into state and with oligarchic and monarchical governments. Centralized imperialism, which was attempted under the Mauryan Empire, c. 325 to 185 BCE, gave way gradually to decentralized administration and to what has been called a feudalistic pattern in the post-Gupta period, i.e., from the 7th century CE. Although the village as an administrative and social unit remained constant, its relationship with the mainstream of history varied. The concept of divine kingship was known but rarely taken seriously, the claim to the status of the caste of royalty becoming more important. Because conformity to the social order had precedence over allegiance to the state, the idea of representation found expression not so much in political institutions as in caste and village assemblies. The pendulum of politics swung from large to small kingdoms, with the former attempting to establish empires, the sole successful attempt being that of the Mauryan dynasty. Thus, true centralization was rare, because local forces often determined historical events. Although imperial or near-imperial periods were marked by attempts at the evolution of uniform cultures, the periods of smaller kingdoms, often referred to as the Dark Ages by earlier historians, were more creative at the local level, and witnessed significant changes in society and religion. These small kingdoms also often boasted the most elaborate and impressive monuments. The major economic patterns were those relating to land and to commerce. The transition from tribal to peasant society was a continuing process, with the gradual clearing of wasteland and the expansion of the village economy based on plough agriculture. Recognition of the importance of land revenue coincided with the emergence of the imperial system in the 4th century BCE. And from this period onward, although the imperial structure did not last long, land revenue became central to the administration and income of the state. Frequent mentions of individual ownership, references to crown lands, numerous land grants to religious and secular grantees in the post-Gupta period, and detailed discussion in legal sources of the rights of purchase, bequest, and sale of land all clearly indicate that private ownership of land existed. Much emphasis has been laid on the state control of the irrigation system. Yet a systematic study of irrigation in India reveals that it was generally privately controlled and that it serviced small areas of land. When the state built canals, they were mainly in the areas affected by both the winter and summer monsoons, in which village assemblies played a dominant part in revenue and general administration, as, for example, in the Chola kingdom of southern India. The urban economy was crucial to the rise of civilization in the Indus Valley, c. 2600 to 2000 BCE. Later, the first millennium BCE saw an urban civilization in the Ganges, Ganga Valley, and still later in coastal South India. The emergence of towns was based on administrative needs, the requirements of trade, and pilgrimage centers. In the first millennium CE, when commerce expanded to include trade with Western Asia, the Eastern Mediterranean, and Central and Southeast Asia, revenue from trade contributed substantially to the economies of the participating kingdoms, as indeed Indian religion and culture played a significant part in the cultural evolution of Central and Southeast Asia. Gold coins were issued for the first time by the Kushan dynasty and in large quantity by the Guptas. Both kingdoms were active in foreign trade. Gold was imported from Central Asia and the Roman Republic and Empire, and later perhaps from Eastern Africa because, in spite of India's recurring association with gold, its sources were limited. Expanding trade encouraged the opening up of new routes, and this, coupled with the expanding village economy, led to a marked increase of knowledge about the subcontinent during the post-modern period. With increasing trade, guilds became more powerful in the towns. Members of the guilds participated in the administration, were associated with politics, and controlled the development of trade through merchant embassies sent to places as far afield as Rome and China. Not least, guilds and merchant associations held envied and respectable positions as donors of religious institutions. The structure of Indian society was characterized by caste. The distinguishing features of a caste society were endogamous kinship groups, jatis, arranged in a hierarchy of ritual ranking, based on notions of pollution and purity, with an intermeshing of service relationships and an adherence to geographic location. There was some coincidence between caste and access to economic resources. Although ritual hierarchy was unchanging, there appears to have been mobility within the framework. Migrations of peoples both within the subcontinent and from outside encouraged social mobility and change. The nucleus of the social structure was the family, with the pattern of kinship relations varying from region to region. In the more complex urban structure, occupational guilds occasionally took on jati functions, and there was a continual emergence of new social and professional groups. Religion in early Indian history did not constitute a monolithic force. Even when the royalty attempted to encourage certain religions, the idea of a state religion was absent. In the main, there were three levels of religious expression. The most widespread was the worship of local cult deities vaguely associated with major deities, as seen in fertility cults, in the worship of mother goddesses, in the Shakti cult, and in Tantrism. Less widespread but popular, particularly in the urban areas, were the more puritanical sects of Buddhism and Jainism and the Bhakti. Devotional tradition of Hinduism. A third level included classical Hinduism and more abstract levels of Buddhism and Jainism, with an emphasis on the major deities in the case of the first, and on the teachings of the founders in the case of the latter two. It was this level, endorsed by affluent patronage, that provided the base for the initial institutionalization of religion. But the three levels were not isolated. The shadow of the third fell over the first two, the more homely rituals and beliefs of which often crept into the third. This was the case particularly with Hinduism, the very flexibility of which was largely responsible for its survival. Forms of Buddhism, ranging from an emphasis on the constant refinement of doctrine on the one hand to an incorporation of magical fertility cults in its beliefs on the other, faded out toward the end of this period. Sanskrit literature and the building of Hindu and Buddhist temples and sculpture both reached apogees in this period. Although literary works in the Sanskrit language continued to be written and temples were built in later periods, the achievement was never again as inspiring. From c. 1500 to c. 500 BCE. By about 1500 BCE, an important change began to occur in the northern half of the Indian subcontinent. The Indus civilization had declined by about 2000 BCE, or perhaps as late as 1750 BCE, and the stage was being set for a second and more lasting urbanization in the Ganges Valley. The new areas of occupation were contiguous with and sometimes overlapping the core of the Harappan area. There was continuity of occupation in the Punjab and Gujarat, and a new thrust toward urbanization came from the migration of peoples from the Punjab into the Ganges Valley. Early Vedic period. In addition to the archaeological legacy discussed above, there remains from this period the earliest literary record of Indian culture, the Vedas. Composed in archaic, or Vedic, Sanskrit, generally dated between 1500 and 800 BCE, and transmitted orally, the Vedas comprise four major texts, the Rig, the Sama, the Yajur, and the Atharva Veda. Of these, the Rig Veda is believed to be the earliest. The texts consist of hymns, charms, spells, and ritual observations current among the Indo-European-speaking people known as Aryans, from Sanskrit Arya, noble, who presumably entered India from the Iranian regions. Theories concerning the origins of the Aryans, whose language is also called Aryan, relate to the question of what has been called the Indo-European homeland. In the 17th and 18th centuries CE, European scholars who first studied Sanskrit were struck by the similarity in its syntax and vocabulary to Greek and Latin. This resulted in the theory that there had been a common ancestry for these and other related languages, which came to be called the Indo-European group of languages. This in turn resulted in the notion that Indo-European-speaking peoples had a common homeland from which they migrated to various parts of Asia and Europe. The theory stirred intense speculation, which continues to the present day, regarding the original homeland and the period or periods of the dispersal from it. The study of Vedic India is still beset by the Aryan problem, which often clouds the genuine search for historical insight into this period. That there was a migration of Indo-European speakers, possibly in waves, dating from the 2nd millennium BCE, is clear from archaeological and epigraphic evidence in Western Asia. Mesopotamia witnessed the arrival about 1760 BCE of the Kassites, who introduced the horse and the chariot and bore Indo-European names. A treaty from about 1400 BCE between the Hittites, who had arrived in Anatolia about the beginning of the second millennium BCE, and the Mitanni Empire invoked several deities, Indra, Uruvna, Mithira, and the Nasatis, names that occur in the Rigveda as Indra, Varuna, Mitra, and the Ashwins. An inscription at Bogaskoye in Anatolia of about the same date contains Indo-European technical terms pertaining to the training of horses, which suggests cultural origins in Central Asia or the southern Russian steppes. Clay tablets dating to about 1400 BCE, written at Tel el-Amarna, in Upper Egypt, in Akkadiya cuneiform, mention names of princes that are also Indo-European. Near India, the Iranian plateau was subject to a similar migration. Comparison of Iranian Aryan literature with the Vedas reveals striking correspondences. Possibly a branch of the Iranian Aryans migrated to northern India and settled in the Sapta Sindhu region, extending from the Kabul River in the north to the Saraswati and upper Ganges to Yamuna Doab in the south. The Saraswati, the sacred river at the time, is thought to have dried up during the later Vedic period. Conceived as a goddess, it was personified in later Hinduism as the inventor of spoken and written Sanskrit and the consort of Brahma, promulgator of the Vedas. It was in the Sapta Sindhu region that the majority of the hymns of the Rigveda were composed. The ancient Vedic religion of India was contemporary with the composition of the Vedas and was the precursor of Hinduism. Often called Vedism, this religion of the Indo-European speaking peoples who entered India sometime before 1500 BC from the region of present-day Iran was a polytheistic system in which Indra was the highest-ranked god. It involved the worship of numerous male divinities connected with the sky and natural phenomena. Ceremonies centered on ritual sacrifice of animals and on the use of soma to achieve trance-like states. These ceremonies, simple in the beginning, grew to be so complex that only trained Brahmins could carry them out correctly. Out of Vedism developed the philosophical concepts of Atman and Brahman. The spread, 8th to 5th century BCE, of the related concepts of reincarnation, karma, and release from the cycle of rebirth through meditation rather than sacrifice marked the end of the Vedic period and the rise of Hinduism. The Hindu initiation ceremony, Upnayana, is a direct survivor of Vedic tradition. The Rigveda is divided into 10 mandalas, books, of which the 10th is believed to be somewhat later than the others. Each mandala consists of a number of hymns, and most mandalas are ascribed to priestly families. The texts include invocations to the gods, ritual hymns, battle hymns, and narrative dialogues. The 9th mandala is a collection of all the hymns dedicated to Soma, the unidentified hallucinogenic juice that was drunk on ritual occasion. Few events of political importance are related in the hymns. Perhaps the most impressive is a description of the battle of the 10 chiefs or kings when Sudas, the king of the preeminent Bharathas of southern Punjab, replaced his priest Vishwamitra with Vasishtha. Vishwamitra organized a confederacy of 10 tribes, including the Puru, Yadu, Turvashas, Anu, and Druhyu, which went to war against Sudas. The Bharathas survived and continued to play an important role in historical tradition. In the Rigveda, the head of a clan is called the Raja. This term commonly has been translated as king, but more recent scholarship has suggested chief as more appropriate in this early context. If such a distinction is recognized, the entire corpus of Vedic literature can be interpreted as recording the gradual evolution of the concept of kingship from earlier clan organization. Among the clans there is little distinction between Aryan and non-Aryan, but the hymns refer to a people called the Dasyus, who are said to have had an alien language and a dark complexion and to worship strange gods. Some Dasyus were rich in cattle and lived in fortified places, puras, that were often attacked by the god Indra. In addition to the Dasyus, there were the wealthy Panis, who were hostile and stole cattle. The early Vedic was the period of transition from nomadic pastoralism to settled village communities intermixing pastoral and agrarian economies. Cattle were initially the dominant commodity, as indicated by the use of the words Gotra, cowpen, to signify the endogamous kinship group, and Gavishti, searching for cows, to denote war. A patriarchal extended family structure gave rise to the practice of niyoga, levirate, which permitted a widow to marry her husband's brother. A community of families constituted a grama. The term Vish is generally interpreted to mean clan. Clan assemblies appear to have been frequent in the early stages. Various categories of assemblies are mentioned, such as Vidita, Samiti, and Sabha, although the precise distinctions between these categories are not clear. The clan also gathered for the yajna, the Vedic sacrifice conducted by the priest, whose ritual actions ensured prosperity and imbued the chief with valor. The chief was primarily a war leader with responsibility for protecting the clan, for which function he received a bali, tribute. Punishment was exacted according to a principle resembling the Vergilde of ancient Germanic law, whereby the social rank of a wronged or slain man determined the compensation due him or his survivors. The beginning of the historical period, c. 500 to 150 BCE. For this phase of Indian history, a variety of historical sources are available. The Buddhist canon, pertaining to the period of the Buddha, c. 6th to 5th century BCE, and later, is invaluable as a cross-reference for the Brahmanic sources. This also is true, though to a more limited extent, of Jain sources. In the 4th century BCE there are secular writings on political economy and accounts of foreign travelers. The most important sources, however, are inscriptions of the 3rd century BCE. Primorian states. Buddhist writings and other sources from the beginning of this period mention 16 major states, Mahajanapada, dominating the northern part of the subcontinent. A few of these, such as Gandhara, Kamboja, Kurupankala, Matsya, Kashi, and Koshala, continued from the earlier period and are mentioned in Vedic literature. The rest were new states, either freshly created from declining older ones or new areas coming into importance, such as Avanti, Ashwaka, Shursena, Vatsa, Sedi, Malla, Vrijji, Magad, and Anga. The mention of so many new states in the eastern Ganges Valley is attributable in part to the eastern focus of the sources and is partly the antecedent to the increasing preeminence of the eastern regions. Location. Gandhara lay astride the Indus and included the districts of Peshawar and the lower Swat and Kabul valleys. For a while its independence was terminated by its inclusion as one of the 22 satrapies of the Achaemenian Empire of Persia, c. 519 BCE. Its major role as the channel of communication with Iran and Central Asia continued, as did its trade in woolen goods. Kamboja adjoined Gandhara in the northwest. Originally regarded as a land of Aryan speakers, Kamboja soon lost its important status, ostensibly because its people did not follow the sacred Brahmanic rites, a situation that was to occur extensively in the north as the result of the intermixing of peoples and cultures through migration and trade. Kamboja became a trading center for horses imported from Central Asia. The Kekayas, Madras, and Ushinaras, who had settled in the region between Gandhara and the Beas River, were described as descendants of the Anu tribe. The Matsyas occupied an area to the southwest of present-day Delhi. The Kurupankala, still dominant in the Ganges to Yamuna Doab area, were extending their control southward and eastward. The Kuru capital had reportedly been moved from Hastinpura to Kaushambi when the former was devastated by a great flood, which excavations show to have occurred about the 9th century BCE. The Mallas lived in eastern Uttar Pradesh. Avanti arose in the Ujjain-Narmada valley region, with its capital at Mahishmati. During the reign of King Pradyuta, there was a matrimonial alliance with the royal family at Kaushambi. Shursena had its capital at Mathura, and the tribe claimed descent from the Yadu clan. A reference to the Sorsenoi in later Greek writings is often identified with the Shursena and the city of Mathura with Mathura. The Vatsa state emerged from Kaushambi. The Sedi state, in Bundelkhand, lay on a major route to the Deccan. South of the Vindhyas, on the Godavari river, Ashwaka continued to thrive. The Mid-Ganges valley was dominated by Kashi and Koshala. Kashi maintained close affiliations with its eastern neighbors, and its capital was later to acquire renown as the sacred city of Varanasi, Benares. Kashi and Koshala were continually at war over the control of the Ganges. In the course of the conflict, Koshala extended its frontiers far to the south, ultimately coming to comprise Uttar, northern, and Dakshina, southern, Koshala. The new states of Magad, Patna and Gaya districts, and Anga, northwest of the delta, were also interested in controlling the river and soon made their presence felt. The conflict eventually drew in the Vridji state, Bihar and Muzaffarpur districts. For a while, Videha, modern Tirhut, with its capital at Mithila, also remained powerful. References to the states of the northern Deccan appear to repeat statements from sources of the earlier period, suggesting that there had been little further exchange between the regions. Political systems. The political system in these states was either monarchical or a type of representative government that variously has been called republican or oligarchic. The fact that representation in these latter states' assemblies was limited to members of the ruling clan makes the term oligarchy, or even chiefdom, preferable. Sometimes within the state itself there was a gradual change from monarchy to oligarchy, as in the case of Vaishali, the nucleus of the Vridji state. Apart from the major states, there also were many smaller oligarchies, such as those of the Kolyas, Mauryas, Jnatrikas, Shakyas, and Lichavis. The Jnatrikas and Shakyas are especially remembered as the tribes to which Mahavira, the founder of Jainism, and Gautama Buddha, respectively, belonged. The Lichavis eventually became extremely powerful. The oligarchies comprised either a single clan or a confederacy of clans. The elected chief or the president, Ganpati or Ganrajya, functioned with the assistance of a council of elders probably selected from the Kshatriya families. The most important institution was the Sovereign General Assembly, or Parishad, to the meetings of which members were summoned by kettledrum. Precise rules govern the seating arrangement, the agenda, and the order of speaking and debate, which terminated in a decision. A distinction was maintained between the families represented and the others. The broad authority of the Parishad included the election of important functionaries. An occasional lapse into hereditary office on the part of the chief may account for the tendency toward monarchy among these states. The divisiveness of factions was a constant threat to the political system. The institutional development within these oligarchies suggests a stabilized agrarian economy. Sources mention wealthy householders, Gahapathis, employing slaves and hired laborers to work on their lands. The existence of Gahapathis suggests the breaking up of clan ownership of land and the emergence of individual holdings. An increase in urban settlements and trade is evident not only from references in the literary sources but also from the introduction of two characteristics of urban civilization, a script and coinage. Evidence for the script dates at least to the 3rd century BCE. The most widely used script was Brahmi, which is germane to most Indian scripts used subsequently. A variant during this period was Kharoshthi, used only in northwestern India and derived from the Aramaic of Western Asia. The most commonly spoken languages were Prakrit, which had its local variations in Shorseni, from which Pali evolved, and Magdi, in which the Buddha preached. Sanskrit, the more cultured language as compared with Prakrit, was favored by the educated elite. Panini's grammar, the Ashtadhyayi, and Yaska's etymological work, the Nirukta, suggest considerable sophistication in the development of Sanskrit. Economy. Silver bent bar coins and silver and copper punchmarked coins came into use in the 5th century BCE. It is not clear whether the coins were issued by a political authority or were the legal tender of monies. The gradual spread in the same period of a characteristic type of luxury ware, which has come to be known as the northern black polished ware, is an indicator of expanding trade. One main trade route followed the Ganges River and crossed the Indo-Gangetic watershed and the Punjab to Taxila and beyond. Another extended from the Ganges Valley via Ujjain and the Narmada Valley to the western coast or, alternatively, southward to the Deccan. The route to the Ganges Delta became more popular, increasing maritime contact with ports on the eastern coast of India. The expansion of trade and consequently of towns resulted in an increase in the number of artisans and merchants. Some eventually formed guilds, shrenis, each of which tended to inhabit a particular part of a town. The guild system encouraged specialization of labor and the hereditary principle in professions, which was also a characteristic of caste functioning. Gradually, some of the guilds acquired caste status. The practice of usury encouraged the activity of financiers, some of whom formed their own guilds and found that investment in trade proved increasingly lucrative. The changed economy is evident in the growth of cities and of an urban culture in which such distinctions as Pura, wall settlement, Durga, fortified town, Nigma, market center, Nagara, town, and Mahandar, city, became increasingly important. Religion. The changing features of social and economic life were linked to religious and intellectual changes. Orthodox traditions maintained in certain sections of Vedic literature were questioned by teachers referred to in the Upanishads and Aranyakas and by others whose speculations and philosophy are recorded in other texts. There was a sizable heterodox tradition current in the 6th century BCE, and speculation ranged from idealism to materialism. The Ajivikas and the Karvakas, among the smaller sects, were popular for a time, as were the materialist theories of the Buddha contemporary Ajita Keshkambalin. Even though such sects did not sustain an independent religious tradition, the undercurrent of their teachings cropped up time and again in the later religious trends that emerged in India. Jainism is a religion of India that teaches a path to spiritual purity and enlightenment through a disciplined mode of life founded upon the tradition of ahimsa, non-violence to all living creatures. Beginning in the 7th to 5th century BCE, Jainism evolved into a cultural system that has made significant contributions to Indian philosophy and logic, art and architecture, mathematics, astronomy and astrology, and literature. Along with Hinduism and Buddhism, it is one of the three most ancient Indian religious traditions still in existence. While often employing concepts shared with Hinduism and Buddhism, the result of a common cultural and linguistic background, the Jain tradition must be regarded as an independent phenomenon. It is an integral part of South Asian religious belief and practice, but it is not a Hindu sect or Buddhist heresy, as earlier scholars believed. The name Jainism derives from the Sanskrit verb ji, to conquer. It refers to the ascetic battle that it is believed Jain renunciants, monks and nuns, must fight against the passions and bodily senses to gain omniscience and purity of soul or enlightenment. The most illustrious of those few individuals who have achieved enlightenment are called Jina, literally, conqueror, and the tradition's monastic and lay adherents are called Jain, follower of the conquerors, or Jaina. This term came to replace a more ancient designation, Niragrantha, bondless, originally applied to renunciants only. Jainism has been confined largely to India, although the recent migration of Indians to other, predominantly English-speaking countries has spread its practice to many Commonwealth nations and to the United States. Precise statistics are not available, but it is estimated that there are roughly 4 million Jains in India and 1 lakh elsewhere. Of all these sects, only two, Jainism and Buddhism, acquired the status of major religions. The former remained within the Indian subcontinent, the latter spread to Central Asia, China, Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia. Both religions were founded in the 6th to 5th century BCE. Mahavira gave shape to earlier ideas of the Nirgranthas, an earlier name for the Jains, and formulated Jainism, the teachings of the Jina, or conqueror, Mahavira, and the Buddha, the enlightened one, preached a new doctrine. There were a number of similarities among these two sects. Religious rituals were essentially congregational. Monastic orders, the Sangha, were introduced with monasteries organized on democratic lines and initially accepting persons from all strata of life. Such monasteries were dependent on their neighborhoods for material support. Some of the monasteries developed into centers of education. The functioning of monks in society was greater, however, among the Buddhist orders. Wandering monks, preaching and seeking alms, gave the religions a missionary flavor. The recruitment of nuns signified a special concern for the status of women. Both religions questioned Brahmanical orthodoxy and the authority of the Vedas. Both were opposed to the sacrifice of animals, and both preached non-violence. Both derived support in the main from the Kshatriya ruling clans, wealthy Gahapathis, and the mercantile community, because trade and commerce did not involve killing, the principle of ahimsa. Non-injury could be observed in these activities. The Jains participated widely as the middlemen in financial transactions, and in later centuries became the great financiers of Western India. While both religions disapproved in theory of the inequality of castes, neither directly attacked the assumptions of caste society. Even so, they were able to secure a certain amount of support from lower caste groups, which was enhanced by the borrowing of rituals and practices from popular local cults. The patronage of women, especially those of royal families, was to become a noticeable feature. Maghan ascendancy. Political activity in the 6th to 5th century BCE centered on the control of the Ganges Valley. The states of Kashi, Koshala, and Magad and the Vriges battled for this control for a century until Magad emerged victorious. Magad's success was partly due to the political ambition of its king, Bimbisara, c. 543 to 491 BCE. He conquered Anga, which gave him access to the Ganges Delta, a valuable asset in terms of the nascent maritime trade. Bimbisara's son Ajatashatru, who achieved the throne through patricide, implemented his father's intentions within about 30 years. Ajatashatru strengthened the defenses of the Maghan capital, Rajagraha, and built a small fort on the Ganges at Patalaigrama, which was to become the famous capital Patliputra, modern Patna. He then attacked and annexed Kashi and Koshala. He still had to subdue the confederacy of the Vriji state, and this turned out to be a protracted affair lasting 16 years. Ultimately, the Vrijis, including the important Lichavi clan, were overthrown, having been weakened by a minister of Ajatashatru, who was able to sow dissension in the confederacy. The success of Magad was not solely attributable to the ambition of Bimbisara and Ajatashatru. Magad had an excellent geographic location controlling the lower Ganges and thus drew revenue from both the fertile plain and the river trade. Access to the delta also brought in lucrative profits from the eastern coastal trade. Neighboring forests provided timber for building and elephants for the army. Above all, nearby rich deposits of iron ore gave Magad a lead in technology. Bimbisara had been one of the earliest Indian kings to emphasize efficient administration, and the beginnings of an administrative system took root. Rudimentary notions of land revenue developed. Each village had a headman who was responsible for collecting taxes and another set of officials who supervised the collection and conveyed the revenue to the royal treasury. But the full understanding of the utilization of land revenue as a major source of state income was yet to come. The clearing of land continued apace, but it is likely that the agrarian settlements were small, because literary references to journeys from one town to another mention long straightreaches of forest paths. After the death of Ajatashatru, c. 459 BCE, and a series of ineffectual rulers, Sheshunga founded a new dynasty, which lasted for about half a century until ousted by Mahapadmananda. The Nandas are universally described as being of low origin, perhaps Sudras. Despite these rapid dynastic changes, Magad retained its position of strength. The Nandas continued the earlier policy of expansion. They are probably connected with wealth, probably because they realized the importance of regular collections of land revenue. Campaigns of Alexander the Great. The northwestern part of India witnessed the military campaign of Alexander the Great of Macedon, who in 327 BCE, in pursuing his campaign to the eastern extremities of the Achaemenian Empire, entered Gandhara. He campaigned successfully across the Punjab as far as the Beas River, where his troops refused to continue fighting. The vast army of the Nandas is referred to in Greek sources, and some historians have suggested that Alexander's Macedonian and Greek soldiers may have mutinied out of fear of this army. The campaign of Alexander made no impression on the Indian mind, for there are no references to it in Indian sources. A significant outcome of his campaign was that some of his Greek companions, such as one Socrates, Aristobulus, and his admiral, Nearchus, recorded their impressions of India. Later Greek and Roman authors, such as Strabo and Arrian, as well as Pliny and Plutarch, incorporated much of this material into their writings. However, some of the accounts are fanciful and make for better fiction than history. Alexander established a number of Greek settlements, which provided an impetus for the development of trade and communication with Western Asia. Most valuable to historians was a reference to Alexander's meeting the young prince Sandrokotos, a name identified in the 18th century as Chandragupta, which provides a chronological landmark in early Indian history. The Mauryan Empire. The accession of Chandragupta Maurya, reigned c. 321 to 297 BCE, is significant in Indian history because it inaugurated what was to become the first pan-Indian empire. The Mauryan dynasty was to rule almost the entire subcontinent, except the area south of present-day Karnataka, as well as substantial parts of present-day Afghanistan. Chandragupta Maurya. Chandragupta overthrew the Nanda power in Magad and then campaigned in central and northern India. Greek sources report that he engaged in a conflict in 305 BCE in the Transindus region with Seleucus I Nicator, one of Alexander's generals, who, following the death of Alexander, had founded the Seleucid dynasty in Iran. The result was a treaty by which Seleucus ceded the Transindus provinces to the Maurya, and the latter presented him with 500 elephants. A marriage alliance is mentioned, but no details are recorded. The treaty ushered in an era of friendly relations between the Mauryas and the Seleucids, with exchanges of envoys. One among them, the Greek historian Megasthenes, left his observations in the form of a book, the Indica. Although the original has been lost, extensive quotations from it survive in the works of the later Greek writers Strabo, Diodorus, and Arrian. A major treatise on political economy in Sanskrit is the Arthashastra of Kautilya, or Kanakya, as he is sometimes called. Kautilya, it is believed, was prime minister to Chandragupta, although this view has been contested. In describing an ideal government, Kautilya indicates contemporary assumptions of political and economic theory, and the description of the functioning of government occasionally tallies with present-day knowledge of actual conditions derived from other sources. The date of origin of the Arthashastra remains problematic, with suggested dates ranging from the 4th century BCE to the 3rd century CE. Most authorities agree that the kernel of the book was originally written during the early Mauryan period, but that much of the existing text is post-Mauryan. According to Jain sources, Chandragupta became a Jain toward the end of his reign. He abdicated in favor of his son Bindusara, became an ascetic, and travelled with a group of Jain monks to southern India, where he died, in the orthodox Jain manner, by deliberate slow starvation. Bindusara. The second Mauryan emperor was Bindusara, who came to the throne about 297 BC. Greek sources refer to him as Amitrochates, the Greek for the Sanskrit Amitragta, destroyer of foes. This name perhaps reflects a successful campaign in the Deccan, Chandragupta having already conquered northern India. Bindusara's campaign stopped in the vicinity of Karnataka, probably because the territories of the extreme south, such as those of the Cholas, Pandyas, and Seras, were well disposed in their relations toward the Mauryas. Ashoka and his successors. Bindusara was succeeded by his son Ashoka, either directly in 272 BC or, after an interregnum of 4 years, in 268 BC. Some historians say c. 265 BC. Ashoka's reign is comparatively well documented. He issued a large number of edicts, which were inscribed in many parts of the empire and were composed in Prakrit, Greek, and Aramaic, depending on the language current in a particular region. Greek and Aramaic inscriptions are limited to Afghanistan and the Transindus region. The first major event in Ashoka's reign, which he describes in an edict, was a campaign against Kalinga in 260 BCE. The suffering that resulted caused him to reevaluate the notion of conquest by violence, and gradually he was drawn to the Buddhist religion. He built a number of stupas. About 12 years after his accession, he began issuing edicts at regular intervals. In one he referred to 5 Greek kings who were his neighbors and contemporaries, and to whom he sent envoys. These were Antiochus to Theos of Syria, the grandson of Seleucus I, Ptolemy; I Philadelphus of Egypt; Antigonus to Gonatas of Macedonia; Magas of Cyrene; and Alexander, of either Epirus or Corinth. This reference has become the bedrock of Mauryan chronology. Local tradition asserts that he had contacts with Khota and Nepal. Close relations with Tissa, the king of Sri Lanka, were furthered by the fact that Mihinda, Ashoka's son, or his younger brother according to some sources, was the first Buddhist missionary on the island. Ashoka ruled for 37 years. After his death, a political decline set in, and half a century later the empire was reduced to the Ganges Valley alone. Tradition asserts that Ashoka's son Kunala ruled in Gandhara. Epigraphic evidence indicates that his grandson Dasharatha ruled in Magad. Some historians have suggested that his empire was bifurcated. In 185 BCE, the last of the Mauryas, Brihadratha, was assassinated by his Brahman commander-in-chief, Pushyamitra, who founded the Shunga dynasty. Financial base for the empire. The Mauryan achievement lay in the ability to weld the diverse parts of the subcontinent into a single political unit, and to maintain an imperial system for almost 100 years. The financial base for an imperial system was provided by income from land revenue and, to a lesser extent, from trade. The gradual expansion of the agrarian economy and improvements in the administrative machinery for collecting revenue increased the income from land revenue. This is confirmed by both the theories of Kautilya and the account of Megasthenes. Kautilya maintained that the state should organize the clearing of wasteland and settle it with villages of Shudra cultivators. It is likely that some 150,000 persons deported from Kalinga by Ashoka after the campaign were settled in this manner. Megasthenes wrote that there were no slaves in India, yet Indian sources speak of various categories of slaves called dasas, the most commonly used designation being dasabritkas, slaves and hired laborers. It is likely that there was no large-scale slavery for production, although slaves were used on the land, in the mines, and in the guilds, along with the hired labor. Domestic slavery was common, however. The nature of land revenue has been a subject of controversy. Some scholars maintain that the state was the sole owner of the land, while others contend that there was private and individual ownership as well. References to private ownership would seem to be too frequent to be ignored. There also are references to the crown lands, the cultivation of which was important to the economy. Two types of taxes were levied, one on the amount of land cultivated and the other on the produce of the land. The state maintained irrigation in limited areas and in limited periods. By and large, irrigation systems were privately controlled by cultivators and landowners. There is no support for a thesis that control of the hydraulic machinery was crucial to the political control of the country. Another source of income, which acquired increasing importance, was revenue from taxes levied on both internal and foreign trade. The attempt at improved political administration helped to break the economic isolation of various regions. Roads built to ensure quick communication with the local administration inevitably became arteries of exchange and trade. Mauryan society. According to Megasthenes, Mauryan society comprised 7 occupational groups: philosophers, farmers, soldiers, herdsmen, artisans, magistrates, and councillors. He defined these groups as endogamous and the professions as hereditary, which has led to their being considered as castes. The philosophers included a variety of priests, monks, and religious teachers. They formed the smallest group, but were the most respected, were exempt from taxation, and were the only ones permitted to marry into the other groups. The farmers were the largest group. The soldiers were highly paid, and, if Pliny's figures for the army are correct, 9,000 elephants, 30,000 cavalry, and 600,000 infantry, their support must have required a considerable financial outlay. The mention of herdsmen as a socioeconomic group suggests that, although the agrarian economy was expanding and had become central to the state income, pastoralism continued to play an important economic role. The artisans probably represented a major section of the urban population. The listing of magistrates and councillors as distinct groups is evidence of a large and recognizable administrative personnel. Mauryan government. The Mauryan government was organized around the king. Ashoka saw his role as essentially paternal. All men are my children. He was anxious to be in constant touch with public opinion, and to this end he travelled extensively throughout his empire and appointed a special category of officers to gauge public opinion. His edicts indicate frequent consultations with his ministers, the ministerial council being a largely advisory body. The officers of the Sannidhatri, treasurer, who kept the account, and the Samhartri, chief collector, who was responsible for revenue records, formed the hub of the revenue administration. Each administrative department, with its superintendents and subordinate officials, acted as a link between local administration and the central government. Kautilya believed that a quarter of the total income should be reserved for the salaries of the officers. That the higher officials expected to be handsomely paid is clear from the salaries suggested by Kautilya and from the considerable difference between the salary of a clerk, 500 panas, and that of a minister, 48,000 panas. Public works and grants absorbed another large percentage of state income. The empire was divided into 4 provinces, each under a prince or a governor. Local officials were probably selected from among the local populace, because no method of impersonal recruitment to administrative office is mentioned. Once every 5 years, the emperor sent officers to audit the provincial administrations. Some categories of officers in the rural areas, such as the Rajjukas, surveyors, combined judicial functions with assessment duties. Fines constituted the most common form of punishment, although capital punishment was imposed in extreme cases. Provinces were subdivided into districts, and these again into smaller units. The village was the basic unit of administration and has remained so throughout the centuries. The headman continued to be an important official, as did the accountant and the tax collector, Sthanika and Gopa, respectively. For the larger units, Kautilya suggests the maintenance of a census. Megasthenes describes a committee of 30 officials, divided into 6 subcommittees, who looked after the administration of Patliputra. The most important single official was the city superintendent, Nagrika, who had virtual control over all aspects of city administration. Centralization of the government should not be taken to imply a uniform level of development throughout the empire. Some areas, such as Magad, Gandhara, and Avanti, were under closer central control than others, such as Karnataka, where possibly the Mauryan system's main concern was to extract resources without embedding itself in the region. Ashoka's edicts. It was against this background of imperial administration and a changing socio-economic framework that Ashoka issued edicts that carried his message concerning the idea and practice of Dhamma, the Prakrit form of the Sanskrit Dharma, a term that defies simple translation. It carries a variety of meanings depending on the context, such as universal law, social order, piety, or righteousness. Buddhists frequently used it with reference to the teachings of the Buddha. This in part colored the earlier interpretation of Ashoka's use of the word to mean that he was propagating Buddhism. Until his inscriptions were deciphered in 1837, Ashoka was practically unknown except in the Buddhist chronicles of Sri Lanka, the Mahavamsa and Dipavamsa, and the works of the northern Buddhist tradition, the Divyavadana and the Ashokavadana, where he is extolled as a Buddhist emperor par excellence whose sole ambition was the expansion of Buddhism. Most of these traditions were preserved outside India, in Sri Lanka, Central Asia, and China. Even after the edicts were deciphered, it was believed that they corroborated the assertions of the Buddhist sources, because in some of the edicts Ashoka avowed his personal support of Buddhism. However, more recent analysis suggest that, although he was personally a Buddhist, as his edicts addressed to the Buddhist Sangha attest, the majority of the edicts, in which he attempted to define Dhamma, do not suggest that he was merely preaching Buddhism. Ashoka addressed his edicts to the entire populace, inscribing them on rock surfaces or on specially erected and finely polished sandstone pillars in places where people were likely to congregate. It has been suggested that the idea of issuing such decrees was borrowed from the Persian Achaemenian emperors, especially from Darius I, but the tone and content of Ashoka's edicts are quite different. Although the pillars, with their animal capitals, have also been described as imitations of Achaemenian pillars, there is sufficient originality in style to distinguish them as fine examples of modern imperial art. The official emblem of India, since 1947, is based on the Pholian capital of the pillar at Sarnath near Varanasi. The carvings contrast strikingly with the numerous small, grey terracotta figures found at urban sites, which are clearly expressions of modern popular art. Ashoka defines the main principles of Dhamma as non-violence, tolerance of all sects and opinions, obedience to parents, respect for the Brahmins and other religious teachers and priests, liberality toward friends, human treatment of servants, and generosity toward all. These suggest a general ethic of behavior to which no religious or social group could object. They also could act as a focus of loyalty to weld together the diverse strands that made up the empire. Interestingly, the Greek versions of these edicts translate Dhamma as eusebia, piety, and no mention is made in the inscriptions of the teachings of the Buddha, which would be expected if Ashoka had been propagating Buddhism. His own activities under the impact of Dhamma included attention to the welfare of his subjects, the building of roads and rest houses, the planting of medicinal herbs, the establishment of centers for tending the sick, a ban on animal sacrifices, and the curtailing of killing animals for food. He also instituted a body of officials known as the Dhammama Matas, who served the dual function of propagating the Dhamma and keeping the emperor in touch with public opinion. Mauryan decline. Some historians maintain that the disintegration of the Mauryan Empire was an aftermath of Ashoka's policies and actions, and that his pro-Buddhist policy caused a revolt among the Brahmins. The edicts do not support such a contention. It has also been said that Ashoka's insistence on non-violence resulted in the emasculation of the army, which was consequently unable to meet the threat of invaders from the northwest. There is, however, no indication that Ashoka deliberately ignored the military wing of his administration, despite his emphasis on non-violence. Other explanations for the decline of the empire appear more plausible. Among these is the idea that the economy may have weakened, putting economic pressure on the empire. It has been thought that the silver currency of the Mauryas was debased as a result of this pressure. The expense required for the army and the bureaucracy must have tied up a substantial part of the income. It is equally possible that the expansion of agriculture did not keep pace with the expansion of the empire, and, because many areas were non-agricultural, the revenue from the agrarian economy may not have been sufficient for the maintenance of the empire. It is extremely difficult to compute the population of the empire, but a figure of approximately 50 million can be suggested. For a population of mixed agriculturalists and others to support an empire of this size would have been extremely difficult without intensive exploitation of resources. Relatively recent excavations at urban sites show a distinct improvement in material prosperity in the post-Mauryan levels. This may be attributable to an increase in trade, but the income from trade was unlikely to have been sufficient to supplement fully the land revenue in financing the empire. It has been argued that the Mauryan bureaucracy at the higher levels tended to be oppressive. This may have been true during the reigns of the first two emperors, from which the evidence is cited, but oppression is unlikely to have occurred during Ashoka's reign, because he was responsible for a considerable decentralization at the upper levels and for continual checks and inspections. A more fundamental weakness lay in the process of recruitment, which was probably arbitrary, with the hierarchy of officials locally recruited. The concept of the state. Allegiance presupposes a concept of statehood. A number of varying notions had evolved by this time to explain the evolution of the state. Some theorists pursued the thread of the Vedic monarchies, in which the clan chief became the king and was gradually invested with divinity. An alternative set of theories arising out of Buddhist and Jain thought ignored the idea of divinity and assumed instead that, in the original state of nature, all needs were effortlessly provided, but that slowly a decline set in and man became evil, developing desires, which led to the notions of private property and of family, and finally to immoral behavior. In this condition of chaos, the people gathered together and decided to elect one among them, the Mahasammata, or Great Elect, in whom they would invest authority to maintain law and order. Thus, the state came into being. Later theories retained the element of a contract between a ruler and the people. Brahmanic sources held that the gods appointed the ruler and that a contract of dues was concluded between the ruler and the people. Also prevalent was the theory of Matsya, which proposes that in periods of chaos, when there is no ruler, the strong devour the weak, just as in periods of drought big fish eat little fish. Thus, the need for a ruler was viewed as absolute. The existence of the state was primarily dependent on two factors, danda, authority, and dharma, in its sense of the social order, i.e., the preservation of the caste structure. The Arthashastra, moreover, refers to the seven limbs, saptanga, of the state as the king, administration, territory, capital, treasury, coercive authority, and allies. However, the importance of the political notion of the state gradually began to fade, partly because of a decline of the political tradition of the republics and the proportional dominance of the monarchical system, in which loyalty was directed to the king. The emergence of the Mauryan Empire strengthened the political notion of monarchy. The second factor was that the dharma, in the sense of the social order, demanded a far greater loyalty than did the rather blunt idea of the state. The king's duty was to protect dharma. And, as long as the social order remained intact, anarchy would not prevail. Loyalty to the social order, which was a fundamental aspect of Indian civilization, largely accounts for the impressive continuity of the major social institutions over many centuries. However, it also deflected loyalty from the political notion of the state, which might otherwise have permitted more frequent empires and a greater political consciousness. After the decline of the Mauryas, the re-emergence of an empire was to take many centuries. From 150 BCE to 300 CE. The disintegration of the Mauryan Empire gave rise to a number of small kingdoms, whose regional affiliations were often to be repeated in subsequent centuries. The Punjab and Kashmir regions were drawn into the orbit of Central Asian politics. The lower Indus Valley became a passage for movements from the north to the west. The Ganges Valley assumed a largely passive role except when faced with campaigns from the northwest. In the northern Deccan there arose the first of many important kingdoms that were to serve as the bridge between the north and the south. Kalinga was once more independent. In the extreme south the prestige and influence of the Sera, Chola, and Pandya kingdoms continued unabated. Yet in spite of political fragmentation, this was a period of economic prosperity, resulting partly from a new source of income, trade, both within the subcontinent and with distant places in Central Asia, China, the Eastern Mediterranean, and Southeast Asia. Rise of small kingdoms in the north. In the adjoining area held by the Seleucids, Diodotus I, the Greek governor of Bactria, rose in rebellion against the Seleucid king Antiochus II Theos and declared his independence, which was recognized by Antiochus about 250 BCE. Parthia also declared its independence. Indo-Greek rulers. A later Bactrian king, Demetrius, reigned c. 190 to c. 167 BCE, took his armies into the Punjab and finally down the Indus Valley and gained control of northwestern India. This introduced what has come to be called Indo-Greek rule. The chronology of the Indo-Greek rulers is based largely on numismatic evidence. Their coins were, at the start, imitations of Greek issues, but they gradually acquired a style of their own, characterized by excellent portraiture. The legend was generally inscribed in Greek, Brahmi, and Khorosti. The best known of the Indo-Greek kings was Menander, recorded in Indian sources as Milinda, reigned 155 to 130 BCE. He is featured in the Buddhist text Milindapanha, Questions of Milinda, written in the form of a dialogue between the king and the Buddhist philosopher Nagsena, as a result of which the king is converted to Buddhism. Menander controlled Gandhara and Punjab, although his coins have been found farther south. According to one theory, he may have attacked the Shangas in the Yamuna region and attempted to extend his control into the Ganges Valley, but, if he did so, he failed to annex the area. Meanwhile, in Bactria the descendants of the line of Eucratides, who had branched off from the original Bactrian line, now began to take an interest in Gandhara and finally annexed Kabul and the kingdom of Taxila. An important Prakrit inscription at Besnagar, Bhilsa district, of the late 2nd century BCE. Inscribed at the instance of Heliodorus, a Greek envoy of Antialcidas of Taxila, records his devotion to the Vaishnav Vasudeva sect. Vaishnav means a worshipper of the Hindu god Vishnu, and Vasuveda is another Hindu god. Central Asian rulers. The Bactrian control of Taxila was disturbed by an intrusion of the Scythians, known in Indian sources as the Shakas, who established the Shaka satrap. They had attacked the kingdom of Bactria and subsequently moved into India. The determination of the Ha rulers of China to keep the Central Asian nomadic tribes, the Zainu, Wusun, and Yuezhi, out of China forced these tribes in their search for fresh pastures to migrate southward and westward. A branch of the Yuezhi, the Da Yuezhi, moved farthest west to the Aral Sea and displaced the existing Shakas, who poured into Bactria and Parthia. The Parthian king Mithridates tried to hold them back, but after his death, 88 BCE, they swept through Parthia and continued into the Indus Valley. Among the early Shaka kings was Maus, or Moga, 1st century BCE, who ruled over Gandhara. The Shakas moved southward under pressure from the Pahlavas, Parthians, who ruled briefly in northwestern India toward the end of the 1st century BCE. The reign of Gondophans being remembered. At Mathura the Shaka rulers of note were Rajawala and Shodasha. Ultimately, the Shakas settled in western India and Malwa and came into conflict with the kingdoms of the northern Deccan and the Ganges Valley, particularly during the reigns of Nahapana, Kashtana, and Rudradman in the first 2 centuries. C. Rudradaman's fame is recorded in a lengthy Sanskrit inscription at Junagadh, dating to 150 CE. Kujula Cadphises, the Yuezhi chief, conquered northern India in the 1st century CE. He was succeeded by his son Bhima, after whom came Kanishka, the most powerful among the Kushan kings, as the dynasty came to be called. The date of Kanishka's accession is disputed, ranging from 78 to 248. The generally accepted date of 78 is also the basis for an era presumably started by the Shakas and used in addition to the Gregorian calendar by the present-day Indian government. The era, possibly commemorating Kanishka's accession, was widely used in Malwa, Ujjain, Nepal, and Central Asia. The Kushan kingdom was essentially oriented to the north, with its capital at Puruspura, near present-day Peshawar, although it extended southward as far as Sanchi and into the Ganges Valley as far as Varanasi. Mathura was the most important city in the southern part of the kingdom. Kanishka's ambitions included control of Central Asia, which, if not directly under the Kushans, did come under their influence. Inscriptions fairly recently discovered in the Gilgit area further attest such Central Asian connections. Kanishka's successors failed to maintain Kushan power. The southern areas were the first to break away, and, by the middle of the 3rd century, the Kushans were left virtually with only Gandhara and Kashmir. By the end of the century, they were reduced to vassalage by the king of the Persian Sasaniya dynasty. Not surprisingly, administrative and political nomenclature in northern India at this time reflected that of Western and Central Asia. The Persian term for the governor of a province, Kshatrapwan, as used by the Achaemenians, was Hellenized into satrap and widely used by these dynasties. Its Sanskrit form was Kshatrapa. The governors of higher status came to be called Mahakshatrapa. They frequently issued inscriptions reflecting whatever era they chose to follow, and they minted their own coins, indicating a more independent status than is generally associated with governors. Imperial titles also were taken by the Indo-Greeks, such as Basilius Basilin, King of Kings, similar to the Persian Shahenshah, of which the later Sanskrit form was Maharadhiraja. A title of Central Asian derivation was the Devaputra of the Kushans, which is believed to have come originally from the Chinese Son of Heaven, emphasizing the divinity of kingship. Oligarchies and kingdoms. Occupying the watershed between the Indus and Ganges valleys, Punjab and Rajasthan were the nucleus of a number of oligarchies, or tribal republics whose local importance rose and fell in inverse proportion to the rise and fall of larger kingdoms. According to numismatic evidence, the most important politically were the Odambaras, Arjunayanas, Malwas, Yodhiyas, Shibis, Kunindas, Trigatas, and Abhiras. The Arjunayanas had their base in the present-day Bharatpuralvar region. The Malwas appear to have migrated from the Punjab to the Jaipur area, perhaps after the Indo-Greek invasions. They are associated with the Malwa era, which has been identified with the Vikram era, also known as the Krita era and dating to 58 BCE. It is likely that southern Rajasthan as far as the Narmada River and the Ujjain district was named Malwa after the Malwas. Yodhiya evidence is scattered over many parts of the Punjab and the adjoining areas of what is now Rajasthan and Uttar Pradesh, but during this period their stronghold appears to have been the Rohtak district, north of Delhi. The frequent use of the term Gana group on Yodhiya coins indicates an adherence to the tribal tradition. References to Shiva, Shiva-related deities, especially Kartikeya or Skanda, the legendary son of Shiva, are striking. The Shibis also migrated from the Punjab to Rajasthan and settled at Madhyamika, near Chitta, now Chittorgarh. Coins of the Kunindas locate them in the Shivalik range between the Yamuna and the Beas rivers. The Trigartas have been associated with the Chamba region of the upper Ravi river, but they also may have inhabited the area of Jalandhara in the plains. The Abhiras lived in scattered settlements in various parts of western and central India as far as the Deccan. Most of these tribes claimed descent from the ancient lineages of the Puranas, and some of them were later connected with the rise of Rajput dynasties. In addition to the oligarchies, there were small monarchical states, such as Ayodhya, Kaushambi, and the scattered Naga kingdoms, the most important of which was the one at Padmavati, Gwalior. Ahichitra, now the Bareilly district of Uttar Pradesh, was ruled by kings who bore names ending in the suffix Mitra. The Shunga kingdom. Magad was the nucleus of the Shunga kingdom, which succeeded the Mauryan. The kingdom extended westward to include Ujjain and Vidisha. The Shangas came into conflict with Vidarbha and with the Yavanas, who probably were Bactrian Greeks attempting to move into the Ganges valley. The word Yavana derives from the Prakrit Yona, suggesting that the Ionians were the first Greeks with whom the Persians and Indians came into contact. In later centuries, the name Yavana was applied to all peoples coming from Western Asia and the Mediterranean region, which included the Romans, Persians, and Arabs. The Shunga dynasty lasted for about 1 century and was then overthrown by the Brahman minister Vasudeva, who founded the Kamma dynasty, which lasted 45 years and following which the Magad area was of greatly diminished importance until the 4th century CE. Kalinga. Kalinga rose to prominence under Kharvela, dated with some debate to the 1st century BCE. Kharvela boasts, perhaps exaggeratedly for a pious Jain, of successful campaigns in the Western Deccan and against the Yavanas and Magad, and of a triumphal victory over the Pandyas of southern India. The Andhras and their successors. The Andhras are listed among the tribal peoples in the Mauryan Empire. Possibly they rose to being local officials and then, on the disintegration of the empire, gradually became independent rulers of the northwestern Deccan. It cannot be ascertained for certain whether the Andhras arose in the Andhra region, i.e., the Krishna-Godavari deltas, and moved up to the northwestern Deccan, or whether their settling in the delta gave it their name. There is also controversy as to whether the dynasty became independent at the end of the 3rd century BC or at the end of the 1st century BCE. Their alternative name, Satavahana, is presumed to be the family name, whereas Andhra was probably that of the tribe. It is likely that Satavahana power was established during the reign of Shatkani I, with the borders of the kingdom reaching across the northern Deccan. Subsequent to this, the Satavahana dynasty suffered an eclipse in the 1st century CE, when it was forced out of the northern Deccan by the Shakas and resettled in Andhra. In the 2nd century CE, the Satavahanas re-established their power in the northwestern Deccan, as evidenced by Shaka coins from this region overstruck with the name Gautamiputra Shatkani. That the Andhras did not control Malwa and Ujjain is clear from the claim of the Shaka king Rudradman to these regions. The last of the important Andhra kings was Yajnashri Shatkani, who ruled at the end of the 2nd century CE and asserted his authority over the Shakas. The 3rd century saw the decline of Satavahana power, as the kingdom broke into small pockets of control under various branches of the family. The Satavahana feudatories then rose to power. The Abhiras were the successors in the Nashik area. The Ikshvakus succeeded in the Krishna-Guntur region. The Kutu dynasty in Kuntala, southern Maharashtra, had close connections with the Satavahanas. The Bodhis ruled briefly in the northwestern Deccan. The Brihatphalyanas came to power at the end of the 3rd century in the Masaliptam area. In these regions the Satavahana pattern of administration continued. Many of the rulers had matronymics, names derived from that of the mother or a maternal ancestor. Many of the royal inscriptions record donations made to Buddhist monks and monasteries, often by princesses, and also land grants to Brahmins and the performance of Vedic sacrifices by the rulers. Southern Indian kingdoms. Significant, historically attested contact between the north and the Tamil regions can be reasonably dated to the Mauryan period. Evidence on the early history of the south consists of the epigraphs of the region, the Tamil Kankam, Sangam literature, and archaeological data. Inscriptions in Brahmi, recently read as Tamil Brahmi, date to between the 2nd century BC and the 4th century CE. Most of the inscriptions record donations made by royalty or by merchants and artisans to Buddhist and Jain monks. These are useful in corroborating evidence from the Kankam literature, a collection of a large number of poems in classical Tamil that, according to tradition, were recited at 3 assemblies of poets held at Madurai. Included in this literature are the 8 anthologies, Ettutoke, and 10 idyls, Pattu Pattu. The grammatical work Tolkappiyam also is said to be of the same period. The literature probably belongs to the same period as the inscriptions, although some scholars suggest an earlier date. The historical authenticity of sections of the Kankam literature has been confirmed by archaeological evidence. Tamilkam, the abode of the Tamils, was defined in Kankam literature as approximately equivalent to the area south of present-day Chennai, Madras. Tamilkam was divided into 13 nadus, districts, of which the region of Madurai was the most important as the core of the Tamil speakers. The 3 major chiefdoms of Tamilkam were those of the Pandya dynasty, Madurai, the Seras, Cheras, Malabar coast, and the hinterland, and the Cholas, Tanjavur and the Kaveri valley, founders of the Chola dynasty. The inscriptions of the Pandyas, recording royal grants and other grants made by local citizens, date to the 2nd century BCE. The chief Nedunjeliya, early 3rd century CE, is celebrated by the poets of the Kankam as the victor in campaigns against the Seras and the Cholas. Sera inscriptions of the 2nd century CE referring to the Irumpore clan have been found near Karur, Tiruchirappalli district, identified with the Korura of Ptolemy. Kankam literature mentions the names of Sera chiefs who have been dated to the 1st century CE. Among them, Nedunjeral Adan is said to have attacked the Yavana ships and held the Yavana traders to ransom. His son Shiguttuvan, much eulogized in the poems, also is mentioned in the context of Gajabahu's rule in Sri Lanka, which can be dated to either the 1st or last quarter of the 2nd century CE, depending on whether he was the earlier or the later Gajbahu. Karikalan, late 2nd century CE, is the best known of the early Chola chiefs, and was to become almost a kind of eponymous ancestor to many families of the south claiming Chola descent. The early capital was at Uriyur, in an area that straight east from the Veggai river in the south to Tondamandalam in the north. The 3 chiefdoms were frequently at war. In addition, there were often hostilities with Sri Lanka. Mention is also made of the ruler of Tondamandalam, with its capital at Kachipuram. There is also frequent mention of the minor chieftains, the Whale, who ruled small areas in many parts of the Tamil country. Ultimately, all the chiefdoms suffered at the hands of the Kalvar, or Kalabras, who came from the border to the north of Tamilkam and were described as evil rulers, but they were overthrown in the 5th century CE with the rise of the Chalukyas, and Pallava dynasties. Kankam literature reflects the indigenous cultural tradition as well as elements of the intrusion of the northern Sanskritic tradition, which by now was beginning to come into contact with these areas, some of which were in the process of change from chiefdoms to kingdoms. In poems praising the chiefs, heroism in raids and gift-giving are hailed as the main virtues. The predominant economy remained pastoral cum-agrarian, with an increasing emphasis on agriculture. The Tamil poems divide the land into 5 ecological zones, or tainas. Among the poems that make reference to social stratification, one uses the word kudi, group, to denote caste. Each village had its sabha, or council, for administering local affairs, an institution that was to remain a fixture of village life. Religious observance consisted primarily in conducting sacrifices to various deities, among whom Murugan was preeminent. Trade with the Yavanas and with the northern parts of the subcontinent provided considerable economic momentum for the southern Indian states. Given the terrain of the peninsula and the agricultural technology of the time, large agrarian-based kingdoms like those of northern India were not feasible, although the cultivation of rice provided a base for economic change. Inevitably, trade played more than a marginal role, and overseas trade became a major economic activity. Almost as soon as the Roman trade began to decline, the Southeast Asian trade commenced. In subsequent centuries, this became the focus of maritime interest. Contacts with the West. Numerous sources from the first millennium BC mention trade between Western Asia and the western coast of India. Hebrew texts refer to the port of Ophir, sometimes identified with Sopara, on the west coast. Babylonian builders used Indian teak and cedar in the 7th and 6th centuries BCE. The Buddhist Jataka literature mentions trade with Baveru, Babylon. After the decline of Babylon, Arab merchants from southern Arabia apparently continued the trade, probably supplying goods to Egypt and the eastern Mediterranean. The discovery of the regular seasonal monsoon winds, enabling ships to sail a straight course across the Arabian Sea, made a considerable difference to shipping and navigation on the route from Western Asia to India. Unification of the Mediterranean and Western Asian world at the turn of the Christian era under the Roman Empire brought Roman trade into close contact with India, overland with northern India, and by sea with peninsular India. The Emperor Augustus received 2 embassies, almost certainly trade missions, from India in 1925 to 21. BC. The Periplus Maris Erythrae, navigation of the Erythraean, i.e. Red Sea, an anonymous Greek travel book written in the 1st century CE, lists a series of ports along the Indian coast, including Mujiris, Cranganore, Kolchi, Korkai, Paduka, and Sopatma. An excavation at Arikamedu, near present-day Puducherry, Pondicherry, revealed a Roman trading settlement of this period, and elsewhere too the presence of Roman pottery, beads, intaglios, lamps, glass, and coins point to a continuous occupation, resulting even in imitations of some Roman items. It would seem that textiles were prepared to Roman specification and exported from such settlements. Graffiti on pottery found at a port in the Red Sea indicates the presence of Indian traders. Large hoards of Roman coins substantiate other evidence. The coins are mainly of the emperors Augustus, reigned 27 BCE to 14 CE, Tiberius, reigned 14 to 37, and Nero, reigned 54 to 68. Their frequency suggests that the Romans paid for the trade in gold coins. Many are overstruck with a bar, which may indicate that they were used as bullion in India. Certainly, the Roman savant Pliny the Elder complained that the Indian luxury trade was depleting the Roman treasury. The coins are found most often in trading centers or near the sources of semi-precious stones, especially quartz and beryl. Cancun literature attests the prosperity of Yavana merchants trading in towns such as Kaveripattinam in the Kaveri Delta. The Periplus lists the major exports of India as pepper, precious stones, pearls, tortoise shells, ivory, such aromatic plants as spikenard, Nardostichis Jatmansi, and Malabathrum, Cinnamomum malabathrum, and silk and other textiles. For these the Romans traded glass, copper, tin, lead. Realgar, a red pigment, orpiment, a gold pigment, antimony, and wine, or else they paid in gold coins. The maritime trade routes from the Indian ports were primarily to the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, from where they went overland to the eastern Mediterranean and to Egypt. But Indian merchants also ventured out to Southeast Asia seeking spices and semi-precious stones. River valleys and the Mauryan roads were the chief routes within India. Greek sources refer to a royal highway built by the Mauryas, connecting Taxila with Patliputra and terminating at Tambalipti, the main port in the Ganges Delta. On the western coast, the major port of Brigukacha, modern Bharuch, was connected with the Ganges Valley via Rajasthan or, alternatively, Ujjain. From the Narmada Valley, there were routes going into the northwestern Deccan and continuing along rivers flowing eastward to various parts of the peninsula. Goods were transported mainly in caravans of oxen and donkeys, but only in the dry seasons, the rains creating impossible conditions for travel. Coastal and river shipping was clearly cheaper than overland transport. The main northern route connected Taxila with Kabul and Kandahar, and from there branched off in various directions, mainly linking up with routes across Persia to the Black Sea ports and the eastern Mediterranean. The route connecting China with Bactria via Central Asia, which would shortly become famous as the Silk Road, linked the oases of Kashgar, Yarkand, Khota, Miran, Kucha, Karshehir, and Turfan, in all of which Indian merchants established trading stations. The Central Asian route brought Chinese goods in large quantities into the Indian and Western Asian markets. It is thought that the prosperity resulting from this trade enabled the Kushans to issue the first Indian gold coins. Another consequence was the popularity of horsemanship. Society and culture. The commercial economy played a central role during this period. Circuits of exchange developed at various levels among groups throughout the subcontinent. In some regions, these patterns extended to external trade. Agrarian expansion was not arrested, and land revenue continued to be a major source of income, but profit from trade made a substantial difference to the urban economy, noticeably improving the standard of living and registering a growth in the number and size of towns. Guilds. The social institution most closely related to commercial activity was the Shreni, or guild, through which trade was channeled. The guilds were registered with the town authority, and the activities of guild members followed strict guidelines called the Shreni Dharma. The wealthier guilds employed slaves and hired laborers in addition to their own artisans, though the percentage of such slaves appears to have been small. Guilds had their own seals and insignia. They often made lavish donations to Buddhist and Jain monasteries, and some of the finest Buddhist monuments of the period resulted from such patronage. In some areas, such as the Deccan, members of the royal family invested money with a particular guild, and the accruing interest became a regular donation to the Buddhist Sangha. This must also have enhanced the political prestige of the guild. Finance. Increasing reliance on money in commerce greatly augmented the role of the financier and banker. Sometimes the wealthier guilds offered financial services, but the more usual source of money was the merchant financier, Shresthin. Coinage proliferated in the various kingdoms, and minting attained a high level of craftsmanship. The most widely used coins were the gold dinaras and suvarnas, based on the Roman denaries, 124 grains, about 8 grams, a range of silver coins, such as the earlier Karshapna, or Pana, 57.8 grains, 3.75 grams, and the Shatmana, an even wider range of copper coins, such as the Masa, Kakani, and a variety of unspecified standards, and other coins issued in lead and cotton, particularly in Western India. Usury was an accepted part of the banker's trade, with 15% being the typical interest rate, although this varied according to the enterprise for which the money was borrowed. Expanding trade also introduced a multiplicity of weights and measures. Impact of trade. Foreign trade probably had its greatest economic impact in the south, but the interchange of ideas appears to have been more substantial in the north. This latter effect may have been attributable to the north's longer association with Western Asia and the colonial Hellenic culture. Greek, along with Aramaic, was widely spoken in Afghanistan and was doubtless understood in Taxila. The spurt of geographic studies in the Mediterranean produced works with extensive descriptions of the trade with India. These include Strabo's Geography, Ptolemy's Geography, Pliny's Natural History, and the Periplus Maris Erythrae. The most obvious and visible impact occurred in Gandhara art, which depicted Indian themes influenced by Hellenistic and Roman styles, an attractive hybrid that influenced the development of Buddhist iconography. The more prized among objects were the ivory carvings that reached Afghanistan from central India. Religious patronage. If art remains an index to patronage, then Buddhism seems to have been the most favored religion, followed by Shaivism and the Bhagavata cult. Buddhist centers generally comprised a complex of 3 structures: the monastery, vihara, the hall of worship, Ketya, and the sacred tumulus, stupa. All of which were freestanding structures in the north, but were initially rock-cut monuments in the Deccan. The Jains found more patrons in the Deccan. Literary sources of the period mention Hindu temples, but none of comparable antiquity have been found. Apart from the Gandhara style of sculpture, a number of indigenous centers in other parts of India, such as Mathura, Karli, Nagarjunakonda, and Amravati, portrayed Buddhist legends in a variety of local stones. The more popular medium was terracotta, by then changed from grey to red, depicting not only ordinary men and women and animal figures, but also large numbers of mother goddesses, indicating the continued popular worship of these deities. The practice of Buddhism was itself undergoing change. Affluent patronage endowed the large monasteries with land and slaves. Association with royalty gave Buddhism access to power. Under the proselytizing consciousness that had gradually evolved, Buddhist monks traveled as missionaries to Central Asia and China, Western Asia, and Southeast Asia. New situations inevitably led to the need for new ideas, as is most clearly seen in the contact of Buddhism with Christianity and Zoroastrianism in Central Asia. Arguments over the original teaching of the Buddha had already resulted in a series of councils called to clarify the doctrine. The 2 main sects were the Theravada, centered at Kaushambi, which compiled the Pali Canon on Buddhist teachings, and the Sarvastivada, which arose at Mathura, spread northward, and finally established itself in Central Asia, using Sanskrit as the language for preserving the Buddhist tradition. A council held in Kashmir during the reign of Kanishka ratified the separation of the 2 main schools of Buddhism, the Mahayana, greater vehicle, and the Theravada, or Hinayana, lesser vehicle. The impressive dominance of Buddhism did not arise without hostility from the patrons of other religions. Jainism had by now also split into two groups, the Digambara, sky-clad, i.e., naked, the more orthodox, and the Shvetambara, white-clad, the more liberal. The Jains were not as widespread as the Buddhists, their main centers being in western India, Kalinga for a brief period, and the Mysore, modern Karnataka, and Tamil country. Brahmanism also underwent changes with the gradual fading out of some of the Vedic deities. The two major gods were Vishnu and Shiva, around whom there emerged a monotheistic trend perhaps best expressed in the Vaishnav Bhagavad Gita, which most authorities would date to the 1st century BCE. The doctrine of karma and rebirth, emphasizing the influence of actions performed either in this life or in former lives on present and future lives, became central to Hindu belief and influenced both religious and social notions. Vedic sacrifices were not discontinued but gradually became symbols of such ceremonial occasion as royal consecrations. Sacrificial ritual was beginning to be replaced by the practice of bhakti, a form of personal devotion whereby the worshipper shares in the grace of the deity. Literature. Popular epics, such as the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, were injected with didactic sections on religion and morality and elevated to the status of sacred literature. Their heroes, Krishna and Rama, were incorporated into Vaishnavism as avatars, incarnations of Vishnu. The concept of incarnations was useful in subsuming local deities and cults. The epics also served as a treasury of stories, which provided themes and characters for countless poems and plays. The works of the dramatist Bhasha, notably Swapnavaswadatta and Pratijnayugandharayana, were foundational to the Sanskrit drama. Ashwaghosa, another major dramatist who wrote in Sanskrit, based his works on Buddhist themes. The popularity of drama necessitated the writing of a work on dramaturgy, the Natya Shastra, treatise on dramatic art, of the sage priest Bharata. The composition of Dharmashastras, collections of treatises on sacred duties, among which the most often quoted is ascribed to Manu, became important in a period of social flux in which traditional social law and usage were important as precedent. A commentary on the earlier Sanskrit grammar of Panini was provided by the Mahabhashya of Patanjali, timely because even the non-Indian dynasties of the north and west made extensive use of Sanskrit. Of the sciences, astronomy and medicine were foremost, both reflecting the interchange of ideas with Western Asia. Two basic medical treatises, composed by Karaka and Sushruta, date to this period. Assimilation of foreigners. The presence of foreigners, most of whom settled in Indian cities and adopted Indian habits and behavior in addition to religion, became a problem for social theorists because the newcomers had to be fitted into caste society. It was easier to accommodate a group rather than an individual into the social hierarchy, because the group could be given a jati status. Technically, conversion to Hinduism was difficult because one had to be born into a particular caste, and it was karma that determined one's caste. The theoretical definition of caste society continued as before, and the four varnas were referred to as the units of society. The assimilation of local cults demanded the assimilation of cult priests, who had to be accommodated within the Brahmanic hierarchy. The Greeks and the Shakas, clearly of non-Indian origin, and initially the ruling group, were referred to as fallen Kshatriyas. The Vaishya and Shudra groups did not pose such a serious problem, because their vague definition gave them social mobility. It is likely that in such periods of social change, some lower caste groups may have moved up the ladder of social hierarchy.